Somebody recently posted a side-by-side comparison of Ugly God's yearly Spotify numbers from 2021 and this year for 2022, and the difference is wild and left others and myself confused. This shows that Ugly God had a huge spike in all of his numbers this year, despite the fact that he hasn't released any music. If you haven't been keeping up with Ugly God over the last few years, don't feel bad, because he really hasn't been releasing anything. Ugly God retweeted this comparison and didn't make a comment on it. To be honest, I'm a little bit skeptical of the numbers shown for the 2022 report. And I don't think that Ugly God posted this himself to any of his platforms other than just retweeting it. But it's possible for other people that are involved with his career to have access to this report, or he could have shared it privately with certain people. With a lot of speculation on what could have caused this huge boost in his streaming numbers, I wanted to share some thoughts on how it could be possible and also discuss the probability of this being real. Let's start with a brief overview of Ugly God's career over the past few years, because that's ultimately why these numbers seem almost too good to be true. Ugly God blew up in 2016, and would then go on to release his debut album in 2017 titled The Booty Tape. It was a light-hearted album, as the name would imply, but it was pretty well received. In 2018, Ugly God was pretty quiet, and he later mentioned that he went through a pretty rough depression during this time. But he still had some features on other people's songs and even dropped some tracks of his own. In 2019, he dropped his second album, Bumps and Bruises. The album only sold 14,000 units the first week. After 2019, Ugly God pretty much disappeared from the internet. In 2020, he dropped a couple of songs in a small collab tape, but other than that, he was gone. Throughout 2021, he featured on one song that year and also dropped a song exclusively on SoundCloud. And then, that was it. We haven't had any new music from Ugly God since. Before we start crunching numbers, I want to say that I like Ugly God, and he seems like a pretty cool guy. I'd personally be excited if he started releasing music again, but he's got to do what's best for him, and I respect that. Now, let's dig into some of these numbers from the 2022 Spotify report. When checking out Ugly God's monthly listeners on Spotify, he currently has 606,000. And remember, he hasn't dropped any music this year or any projects, so there shouldn't have been any large spikes or dips in this number throughout the year. But just in case, while we're trying to see what his yearly listeners would be based off that number, let's round it up to 700,000. So if we multiply that by 12 for the amount of months in the year, we get 8.4 million yearly listeners, which falls a little short of the 19.4 million listeners that was shown on the report. I'm not saying that this is enough to debunk it or say it's totally fake, but I think it's a fair way to put things into perspective. Either way, with 8.4 million listeners in 2022, that's over double what it was in 2021, just a year ago, which is very impressive for an artist that hasn't released any music this year. There are a lot of artists that have continued to release music and have had their streams decline. Now let's look at the hours streamed. I don't have much to go on for the total streaming hours, but if he really did have 3.6 million hours streamed this year, his listeners would have had to spend a lot of time just listening to Ugly God. Here's a comparison of another artist's 2022 Spotify report that's in a close ballpark for hours streamed. Shout out to Savage Gasp, because we'll be using his report for this video. I encourage you to look at the difference in listeners between the two. According to this, Ugly God had about 10 million more this year. Keep that in mind, and let's now look at what Savage Gasp's monthly listeners are on Spotify. Wow, over 2 million monthly listeners compared to Ugly God's 600,000. Once again, this doesn't disprove anything, but it does help put some of these numbers into perspective so that you can make your own decision. There were two theories I saw on Twitter being kicked around to try and explain these streaming numbers. The first was that TikTok perhaps is picking up some of his old songs to make them retrend. And the second is some people believe that bots are involved to inflate the streams, which I think is the most unlikely scenario. I don't think that anyone is trying to falsely inflate Ugly God's streams, especially not him. I'm not saying that it's impossible that this is his real 2022 report, but I personally doubt it after looking more into the numbers and also the numbers of other artists. My theory is that somebody posted this and Ugly God saw it, thought it was funny, and then retweeted it. But I could definitely be wrong. Maybe one day we'll find out for sure. But until then, I'll continue to wait and hope for more music from Ugly God. Thanks for watching. I'd love to hear what you think. Is this 2022 report real or fake? If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. I post hip-hop content weekly. Have a great day.